Welcome back. The materials that we'll be using for this class to make these three items will be one skein. So that's all we need. One skein will make all three projects, plus you'll have some yarn left over to make more cup cozies if you like. So I'm using Bernat, I like to call it Bernat soft chunky yarn, and it is very chunky. It's a great yarn to use for comfy projects like this. And even though I really like the whole being in the moment, that present, slow knitting, we just want to focus on what we're doing. The reality is we really do want to see something, show for it at the end of it. So by using this bulkier type of yarn when you're first beginning to learn to knit, and the large needles that they recommend go with this, you will see a quicker process in the slow knitting, and that will make sense to you. So you're slow knitting, you're being very deliberate, you're watching every stitch, but because it's bulky yarn, the project knits up very quick. So on the label, on the yarn label, all yarn labels will have the type of, the size of the yarn. So this is super bulky, and it's 6. Super bulky 6. And the recommended, and I say that, they just say recommended. You don't always need to use what they recommend. The recommended needle size is the 8mm size. So that's that US 11 8mm. And you can use the straight needles, any size, because we're not making a lot of stitches for these two projects. We are making 30 stitches for this. You will still be able to get 30 stitches on a longer straight yarn, but with one of these, I just like to use this. These circular needles are not necessary for this class. It's just my preference, and you'll develop your preference as well. It took me 30 years to like these needles. I didn't like circular needles. I didn't knit in the round. I rather knit flat pieces, and then with a crochet hook or a darning needle or steeking, that's when you cut it. You cut your work, but that's something that you'll learn at that for a lot of fair isle projects and knitting in the round, and it's okay to do that because it makes sense to do so. So we've got the yarn, the nice bulky yarn that we're going to use. We are going to use the recommended needles, 8, the 8mm needles. Now, when I say it's not necessary to use what they recommend, because you're going to develop the type of knitting that you do. So you might knit exactly using like what they say, because like here, what they'll say is like a 4" by 4", which is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters square. If you use this size needle, it tells you that you will need to do 11 stitches by 14 rows. We'll make 11 stitches by 14 rows. We'll make a 4 by 4 square, or 10 by 10 centimeters. That's if you use the 8mm. I'm a looser knitter. I knit quite loose. So if I knit 14 rows and put 11 stitches, cast on 11 stitches, my piece will be larger than a 4 by 4 square. Sometimes, especially when you are first learning to knit, people can knit very tight. So if you cast on 11 stitches and do 14 rows, if you can be very tight, you won't be making a 4 by 4 square. You'll be making, maybe a 3.5 by 3 3/4 square, or even smaller than that. So what I recommend is that you knit your way. Knit what's comfortable for you. If I always stuck by being a loose knitter, stuck by what they said, what they recommended, my fitted wear would be too big. So what I do, if I'm going to make something that I'm going to wear, I will either use a smaller needle, so I might use a 6mm or 7mm needle to get, like if I'm following a pattern, to get the sizing, Or I might just use a thinner yarn or a thicker yarn. I think it's a lot of fun to experiment. And so it's a lot of fun to like just tell everybody that you know that you're learning to knit. And people come out of all sorts of places and will give you some knitting supplies and yarn and things like that. You can use, charity shop yarn when you're learning to practice. You can, a lot of people don't like to do this, and I do it all the time. Knit something and you're not sure what you're going to do with it, so it goes off to the side, but then you go, oh, that's a perfect yarn for something else. And I just unravel it and reuse the yarn again for something else. You will get to know your knitting style. So for this, we are going to use the recommended needle size for this type of yarn to make these 3 things. But you might find that your knitting is too tight or too loose, or it could be just right. You can unravel it and then do different math and start again. So that's the wool. These are the needles. We will be doing, you always have a little pair of scissors hanging around. I'm going to use my darning needle to sew up these things. I'm going to have a measuring tape because I'm going to make a swatch to see if I'm a loose knitter or a tight knitter. I'll show you that in the next lesson. And then for this at-home cozy, I do have some buttons that I might be using. That's all the supplies that you need. While you've got the teapot and the cup out, why don't you make yourself a cup of tea and come back and join me in the next lesson where we are going to learn to cast on, and then we're going to knit the garter stitch and bind off and make these projects.